I saw it today. His penis. And I felt it was twice the size of any Japanese man I had ever known. I froze, ashamed but also curious. Back in the land I once called home, men saw us not as women with dignity, but as tools, as nurses for their bodies, and as vessels for their hunger. The words, stark and raw, were never meant for public ears. They came from the lips, or perhaps the trembling hand, of a Japanese nurse named Aiko, a woman caught between two collapsing worlds during the Second World War. It was not a novelist's invention. It was a prisoner's confession, scribbled in secrecy, a fragment of a story long buried in dust and silence. In the summer of 1944, Aiko stood inside a prison infirmary, a place of sickness and sweat, where wounded men lay in rows and the air stank of iodine. She was not there by choice. Captured during a retreat, she had been pressed into service by her captors, told to tend to the very soldiers who had destroyed her unit. The Americans. To her, they were supposed to be monsters, hulking brutes who cared nothing for honor, who desecrated women without shame. At least that was the portrait painted by her homeland. But in a single moment, as she bent to change the bandage of a feverish man, her eyes caught what no propaganda had prepared her for. Flesh, raw and undeniable. A body that was supposed to be grotesque was instead disarmingly human. The sight left her shaken not simply because of size, but because of what it forced her to admit, that she had compared. That she could no longer pretend not to see. This was only the beginning. The true shock lay not in anatomy, but in the cascade of revelations that followed. Over weeks and months, she would witness behaviors that unraveled every truth she had been raised to believe. She saw American men thank women. She saw female nurses scold soldiers and be obeyed. She saw captives laugh in the shadow of barbed wire. And at last, she experienced something forbidden. Intimacy with the enemy and the staggering realization that he did not hide it. For Aiko, this was not merely a cultural dissonance. It was an earthquake beneath the foundations of her soul. She had lived her life in a nation where women were expected to serve, to be silent, to bear duty as naturally as breathing. She had never imagined a world where a woman could be spoken to as equal, or cherished without secrecy. The questions that sprang from that one glance, that one forbidden sight, would not let her rest. What did it mean to be Japanese when loyalty demanded silence? What did it mean to be a woman when dignity was denied? And what did it mean that she felt freer in captivity than she ever had in the streets of her own city? The story of Aiko is not comfortable. It begins with shame, crosses into desire, and ends in rebellion, not against soldiers or states, but against the invisible chains of her upbringing. It is a story of shock upon shock, each one breaking the world she thought she knew. And in the ashes of war, when prisoners were exchanged and nations reclaimed their citizens, Aiko faced a choice that would define her forever: return to the homeland that demanded her silence, or remain in the land of her captors, where she had first been seen as a woman. How does one moment, a glimpse that should never have happened, unravel an entire life of loyalty and silence? How does a prisoner, bound by barbed wire, come to feel freer than in her own home? And what can we, decades later, learn from the way a single woman's gaze pierced the myths of empire? This is her story. Before captivity, before the prison walls and the American infirmary, there was Japan. Not the Japan of postcards or ancient temples, but the Japan of the late 1930s and early 1940s, where a nation wrapped in empire demanded obedience from all who lived within it. For Aiko, the path to becoming a nurse was never truly her choice. She had been the daughter of a schoolteacher in a coastal town, raised with the expectation that she would serve her family, her emperor, and the men around her. Even in her studies, her instructors reminded her that her hands were not hers to keep. They belonged to the nation. If men were the swords of the empire, women were the sheath, useful only in holding, protecting, and preserving. In the hospital wards of her training years, she saw the hierarchy with brutal clarity. Male doctors barked orders. Male patients shouted demands. And the women, always the women, bowed, obeyed, endured. Sometimes she wondered whether the illness they treated most was not fever or wounds, but the arrogance of men who believed themselves lords of creation. Yet she swallowed her questions. To ask was to rebel, and to rebel was to betray. Her earliest encounters with intimacy were equally shaped by silence and submission. She recalled the first time a young officer cornered her in a supply room. His hand pressed against her shoulder, his breath heavy with sake. She froze not because she wanted it, but because she knew there was no protest that would be heard. When it ended, he straightened his uniform and left without a word. For him, she was not a woman with dignity but a vessel. For her, the shame was expected, almost ordinary. She did not even write of it in her diary, for fear that words might make it real. Outside the hospital walls, the country marched to the drum of militarism. Radios blared speeches about destiny, about divine right, about the strength of the Yamato race. Children carried wooden rifles in parades. Women stitched flags for soldiers, whispering prayers into each seam. And yet beneath the layers of patriotism, Aiko sensed a quiet despair. Mothers sent sons to war and received ashes in return. Wives bowed to photographs that would never embrace them again. In this world, sacrifice was not noble, it was demanded, stripped of choice, wrapped in the illusion of honor. For women the burden was heavier still. The government proclaimed them pillars of the home front, but in practice they were invisible pillars, expected to hold the weight without ever being seen. Even the act of becoming a nurse was framed not as a profession but as service. Aiko's superiors often reminded her that she was fortunate. "You are blessed," they said, "to serve our brave men. Through them you touched the emperor himself." And so she endured. Day after day she changed bandages, measured pulses, delivered children, and lowered her eyes. Her own desires, her own questions were tucked away like contraband. Sometimes, late at night, she would stand at the hospital balcony and stare at the sea. The waves seemed freer than any human she knew. They came and went without permission. They did not bow. It was in this climate of silent endurance that the war escalated. When Japan advanced across Asia, she was assigned to a military medical unit, told that her skills were needed on the front. She did not volunteer, she obeyed. To refuse would have been unthinkable. And so she left behind her coastal town, her aging parents, and the narrow life she had known, stepping into a world of blood and fire. The front lines were worse than she had imagined. Wounded soldiers poured in day after day, mangled by artillery, their cries echoing through makeshift tents. She worked until her fingers blistered, until her back bent, until she could no longer remember the softness of a bed. But what haunted her most were not the wounds of flesh, it was the way men treated her amidst their suffering. Even on the edge of death they leered. Even with their bodies broken they demanded. She was a nurse, a caretaker, a woman. In their eyes that meant she was theirs. There were rumors, whispered in the darkness, of comfort women stationed nearby, of brothels operated by the military itself. Aiko pretended not to hear. She did not need confirmation to know what it meant. Women reduced to instruments of war, their dignity devoured by the machinery of empire. She wondered sometimes if her fate might one day be no different. And then came the retreat. The American advance was relentless, and her unit, once so confident, crumbled under the weight of superior firepower. She remembered the night they abandoned the camp, carrying only what they could hold, stumbling through forests and rivers as bombs lit the sky. The men cursed, the wounded groaned, and she, clutching her medical kit, followed blindly. Capture was sudden, almost anticlimactic. One moment she was hiding among bamboo, the next she was surrounded by foreign voices, rifles pointed, orders shouted in a language she barely understood. For the first time in her life she was powerless not just as a woman, but as a soldier of the empire. The men she had served with were dragged away, some beaten, some executed. She expected the same. But death did not come. Instead she was taken to a prison camp. There her captors looked at her not as a spy, not as a soldier but as something else, a nurse. Her skills, they decided, were useful. She would tend to the sick and wounded, this time not her own countrymen, but the very enemy she had been raised to despise. It was in that prison infirmary, surrounded by the moans of American soldiers, that Aiko began to see the cracks in her world. The empire had demanded loyalty, obedience, silence. But in the faces of her captors she began to glimpse something she had never known: curiosity, laughter, even respect. And in one moment, one forbidden glimpse of a man's body, her carefully constructed walls collapsed. The Japan she had left behind was rigid, bound by chains invisible yet unbreakable. In captivity she would learn that those chains could be broken. But first she had to endure the shock of discovery. The prison infirmary was a world within a world. Outside its walls, barbed wire coiled like snakes, and guards patrolled with rifles slung across their shoulders. Inside there were rows of cots, the smell of antiseptic, the quiet groans of the wounded. For Aiko it was both familiar and alien. She had worked in hospitals before, but never for men who wore the uniforms of her enemies. She moved as she always had, quiet, efficient, obedient. She washed wounds, changed bandages, measured pulses. But beneath her calm exterior, her senses were alert, her mind recording every detail. It was here, amidst the daily rituals of medicine, that the shock began. The first came with a glimpse. She had been tending to a soldier with a leg wound, his fever high, his body restless. As she bent to adjust his sheets, her eyes fell upon what was not meant to be seen. For a heartbeat she froze. The sight of his nakedness struck her like lightning. Not because she had never seen a man before, she had too many times, in contexts that left her feeling used and diminished. No, the shock was comparison. This body was different. Stronger, larger. Unfamiliar in a way that forced her to admit she had carried expectations. She pulled the sheet back up quickly, her hands trembling, ashamed of her curiosity. But the image lingered. It was not merely anatomy, it was a symbol. A confrontation with the fact that the enemy she had been told to hate was not a monster, but a man. And perhaps, in some unspoken way, more than the men she had known. Yet it was what followed that shook her more deeply. In Japan, men never thanked women. Gratitude was assumed, invisible, unnecessary. But here, in this camp, soldiers, American soldiers, looked her in the eye and said the words aloud. Thank you. Simple, quiet, but genuine. The first time it happened she nearly laughed, thinking it a trick. Yet it happened again and again. A soldier with bandaged ribs. Another with a broken arm. Each time the words carried weight she had never known. Gratitude not as duty but as choice. Then came the authority of women. One day she watched as an American nurse, one of their own, brought in from outside, scolded a soldier for refusing his medicine. He grumbled, resisted, but in the end obeyed. No shame was cast on her for raising her voice. No one whispered that she had overstepped. For Aiko it was unthinkable. In Japan, a woman who dared to chastise a man would be silenced, dismissed, perhaps punished. Yet here it was accepted, even expected. Each of these moments struck her like a blow. Small, perhaps, to an outsider. But to a woman raised in silence, they were revelations. She began to notice laughter too. Even in captivity, Americans laughed, loud, unrestrained, as if defying the very fences that confined them. Japanese soldiers never laughed in war. To laugh was weakness, disrespect, a crack in the mask of duty. But here it seemed laughter was survival. At night, when she lay on her cot, these images replayed in her mind. The forbidden glimpse. The words of gratitude. The scolding nurse. The echo of laughter. Each one was a fracture in the armor of her upbringing, widening cracks she could no longer ignore. Her shock grew when she overheard conversations. Men spoke of their homes, their wives, their sweethearts, not as possessions but as partners. They spoke of longing, of missing, of respect. Aiko thought of the men she had known back home, who spoke of women as conveniences, obligations, burdens. To hear the enemy speak differently was disorienting, as if she had stumbled into another world. Still she resisted. Loyalty tugged at her. She told herself it was all a facade, a performance designed to weaken her resolve. She tried to remember the emperor, the homeland, the duty that had shaped her life. But each day in the infirmary chipped away at that resolve. The culmination came not in a glance or a word, but in a gesture. One evening, as she struggled to lift a heavy basin of water, a soldier, his arm in a sling, rose from his cot to help her. She protested, ashamed, insisting she could manage. But he smiled and insisted, steadying the basin until it was safely set down. A man helping a woman with her burden. not ordering her, not taking advantage, simply helping. It was such a small act. Yet in that moment, Aiko felt something she had never felt before: respect. Not the empty respect preached by propaganda, but something tangible, human, undeniable. And it terrified her. Because with respect came possibility. And with possibility came desire, the most forbidden feeling of all. She found herself lingering at his bedside, watching the rise and fall of his chest, listening to the cadence of his foreign words. She caught herself wondering what his laughter would sound like if it were directed at her. She hated herself for it, but the thought would not leave. The prison, meant to confine her, was instead expanding her world. Each day she discovered not just the humanity of her captors, but the inhumanity of the silence she had left behind. And it all began with that first forbidden glimpse, the shock that shattered her defenses and forced her to see. The infirmary, once a place of routine, became a theater of tension. Every step Aiko took carried weight. Every glance felt dangerous. The walls pressed closer, the air heavier. She knew she was walking a razor's edge. It began with stolen moments. The soldier with the sling, the one who had helped her with the basin, became her focus. His name was Thomas. She learned it not through introductions but by hearing the others call him. His voice carried warmth even in weakness, and his humor had a way of filling the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. At first she tried to keep her distance. She tended to him as she would any other, measured pulse, replaced bandages, recorded fevers. Yet the barrier between nurse and patient blurred with every exchange. When he thanked her, his eyes lingered. When she turned away, she felt his gaze upon her, steady, unashamed. The conflict inside her grew unbearable. Loyalty to her homeland urged her to look away, to bury the stirring in her chest. Yet something deeper, older than flags, older than duty, kept pulling her back. One night the infirmary was quiet. The wounded slept, guards drowsed at their posts, and the kerosene lamp cast long shadows on the walls. Aiko moved from cot to cot, checking, adjusting, listening to the slow rhythm of breaths. When she reached Thomas, he was awake, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Can't sleep?" she asked, surprising herself with the softness of her voice. He turned his head, smiling faintly. "Not with all this noise in my head." She almost laughed, her first laugh in months. It slipped out before she could stop it, a sound she barely recognized as her own. And in that fragile instant, the distance between them collapsed. She sat beside his cot, listening as he spoke of home. He described fields of corn that stretched farther than sight, a porch where his mother used to sing, a sister who wrote letters filled with gossip and affection. His words painted landscapes Aiko had never known. They were not tales of conquest but of belonging. Without meaning to, she shared her own fragments. A childhood garden. A mother's quiet touch. The sting of rules that silenced her voice. Her words trembled, but he listened, truly listened, as if her memories were treasures. It was then that he reached out, his hand brushing hers. She flinched, instinct screaming of danger, dishonor, punishment. But when she looked into his eyes, there was no command, no hunger. Only invitation. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, she did not pull away. What followed was not the hurried taking she had come to expect from men. It was patient, deliberate, shaped by respect as much as desire. In a world of confinement they carved out freedom, if only for a night. When dawn came, Aiko braced herself for shame. She expected Thomas to look away, to treat her as something secret, disposable. Instead he smiled openly, unafraid of witnesses. He greeted her with warmth that carried no trace of concealment. It was this, more than the act itself, that shook her to her core. In Japan, such intimacy would have been hidden, denied, wrapped in silence. A woman's worth diminished the moment she gave herself. But Thomas spoke to her in the morning light with no shadow of regret. He treated her as a partner, not a possession. Her world crumbled. The propaganda that had filled her youth, the chants of purity, the exaltation of sacrifice, sounded hollow now. She had crossed the line and in doing so discovered not corruption but dignity. But dignity came with danger. She knew discovery would mean ruin. Guards were watchful, whispers lethal. The weight of secrecy bore down on her even as her spirit soared. She found herself caught between fear and longing, between silence and revelation. Yet the greatest shock was not fear but her own yearning. For the first time she felt what it meant to be desired without being demeaned, to be touched without being owned. It was intoxicating, terrifying, liberating. Each day after she saw the world differently. The infirmary was no longer just cots and wounds, but a place where new rules were possible. She watched Thomas joke with his comrades, saw how they accepted his words without question, how they treated him not as a pawn but as a man. And she wondered, could such acceptance extend to her, even as a prisoner, even as a woman branded enemy? The question haunted her. It drove her deeper into reflection, forced her to reckon with the truth. She was no longer the woman who had bowed to silence. She had crossed the line and there was no return. When the war finally ended, the camp trembled with the weight of news. Word traveled faster than orders. Men who had long carried despair now shouted with joy, their voices breaking against the wire fences. Guards lowered their rifles. The air itself felt changed, lighter, as if the earth had exhaled after years of suffocation. For Aiko, liberation was not simple. She was still a prisoner, yet no longer bound by the same chains. Her homeland had lost. The emperor's voice, carried over the radio, spoke words she thought she would never hear: surrender. The divine figurehead of her childhood sounded human, almost broken. That voice marked the death of the world she had known. Repatriation was promised. Ships would come. Japanese prisoners would return to their defeated nation. For many, it was a chance to go home, to reunite with family, to reclaim identity. For Aiko it was a sentence. Home no longer meant safety. It meant silence. It meant returning to a land where her worth was measured not by her hands that healed, nor her heart that yearned, but by her obedience to men who saw her as expendable. Thomas noticed her hesitation. "You don't want to go back, do you?" he asked one evening as the camp awaited orders. She tried to deny it, but the truth pressed against her lips. Finally she whispered, "Home is not home anymore." He did not press, did not offer promises he could not keep. Instead he spoke of possibility. America was not perfect, he admitted that with disarming honesty. But it was a place where voices like hers might be heard, where women fought for rights and sometimes won, where silence was not the only option. The idea frightened her more than captivity ever had. To step into a world unknown, to cut ties with everything familiar, to choose exile over return. Such a decision bordered on betrayal. Yet what was left to betray? The nation that had raised her in chains of loyalty had already fallen. The emperor's silence in her soul was louder than his words on the radio. Her nights became battlegrounds of thought. She replayed the forbidden glimpse, the moments of gratitude, the laughter, the helping hand, the night she crossed the line. Each memory was a stone on the scale, weighing her choice. She asked herself whether her future lay in rebuilding ruins or stepping into the unknown. The day came when names were called. Groups of Japanese prisoners were gathered, their belongings few, their eyes hollow with loss and anticipation. Aiko stood among them, her heart pounding. But when her name echoed across the yard, she did not step forward. Whispers spread. A nurse refusing repatriation? A woman turning her back on her country? The guards frowned, uncertain. The Americans looked on with curiosity. But Aiko stood firm. Her choice was not born of defiance, but of awakening. She had seen another way of being, and she could not unsee it. The months that followed were filled with paperwork, interrogation, suspicion. She was questioned by officers, examined for motives, treated as both an anomaly and a risk. Yet through it all she remained resolute. Her voice, once trained to be small, now carried steady. When she was finally granted permission to stay, she walked out of the camp not as a prisoner, but as a woman reborn. Behind her lay the ashes of loyalty to a homeland that had never cherished her. Ahead lay uncertainty but also possibility. Her relationship with Thomas did not unfold like a fairy tale. War had scarred them both, and the world they faced was complicated. Yet in the simple fact that he did not hide her, did not shame her, did not treat her as a secret, she found the dignity she had been denied all her life. Years later, when she reflected on her journey, She did not dwell on battles or flags. What remained were the small moments, the words "thank you," the sound of laughter, the touch that carried respect. These were the fragments that stitched together her new identity. She never forgot the first shock, that forbidden glimpse that shattered her silence. But she came to understand it was never about flesh alone. It was about discovery. About seeing the enemy not as monster but as mirror. About realizing that the borders that divided nations were not as powerful as the respect that united hearts. Her story was not one of betrayal, but of transformation. She had left behind a homeland that silenced her, and chosen instead a life where her voice mattered. The war had taken much, but it had also given her the most unexpected gift, the chance to be free. And so, when asked if she ever regretted not returning, she would smile faintly and reply, "I did go home. It just wasn't the place I was born." History often leaves us with statistics, dates, and treaties. It speaks in the language of generals and governments, of victories and defeats. But stories like Aiko's remind us that history is also intimate, fragile, and deeply human. It is not just about armies clashing across oceans. It is about a single woman in a single room, seeing the world differently for the first time. And from that moment, everything changes. Perhaps that is why we tell these stories. Not because they are easy, but because they ask us questions we cannot ignore. How many lives were altered by small moments of respect, of dignity, of kindness, even in the heart of war? How often do we inherit beliefs that crumble when tested against the simple act of another human being treating us as equal? These are not questions confined to the past. They follow us into the present. As you've listened to this journey, from silence to awakening, from obedience to choice, you may have found echoes in your own life. Times when you were expected to accept a role, to remain quiet, to follow rules written by others. Times when one gesture, one word, one glimpse of possibility cracked open your understanding of the world. If so, then Aiko's story is not just history. It is a mirror. And here is where you become part of the conversation. This space, this channel, is not only for listening. It is for reflecting, for sharing, for asking questions that others might be afraid to ask. Your thoughts, your perspectives, your experiences, these are what keep history alive. Without them, stories fade back into silence. So I ask you, what struck you most about Aiko's journey? Was it the shock of discovery, the challenge to her beliefs, or the courage to step into a life beyond her homeland? Do you see parallels in your own life, in your own culture, in the choices you or those around you have faced? I invite you to share your reflections in the comments below. Not as right or wrong answers, but as part of an ongoing dialogue about what history means to us today. If you found value in this story, if it moved you, challenged you, or made you pause to think, I encourage you to pass it on. Share it with a friend who loves history, with someone curious about the hidden corners of the past, or with anyone who believes that even in war humanity can break through. These stories gain strength when they travel, when they are spoken and heard by many. And finally, if you want to continue exploring with us, if you want to hear more of the untold, the forgotten, the human stories behind the headlines of war, then I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Each week, we open another door into the past, bringing voices like Aiko's back into the present. By subscribing, you ensure you won't miss the next journey. By liking and sharing, you help us keep these stories alive. History is not finished. It is lived again each time we tell it, each time we listen, each time we let it change us. Be part of that living history. Leave a comment. Share the story. Subscribe to the journey. Because in doing so, you honor not only the past but also the possibilities of the present.